my screen. All right. I'm going to pin our guest, Judi. Thank you so much, Judi, for joining us. Let's see. Just going to scroll to the top of the questions. All right. All right, so the first question is, are there any Wampanoag elders still living today who can speak the language fluently?
Yeah, so the Wampanoag community is unique in that the last living speaker died, we think, probably 150 years ago. So in most Indigenous communities, when there is a language revitalization effort, it is usually using the elders, right, and the ancient knowledge that they still have before they pass on, and having them teach younger people in the community the language. But because the last living speaker in the Wampanoag community died so long ago, there were no living speakers whatsoever. And so for that reason, the project and its work is really unprecedented. As a result, it's mostly young people who are learning the language, and it's sort of a reverse paradigm where young people are actually teaching the elders the language. So it's kind of an interesting approach.
Thank you. All right, our next question. I'm curious to see the main speakers refer to themselves as Indians and having visions of, quote, other Indians she couldn't understand. I would love to hear more about the nomenclature, Indians, First People, Native Americans, etc., and which is preferred and most respectful.
I think for Native communities, there is a self-identification as Indian, American Indian, Native American, tribal community member. It really runs the gamut. And I think it's just, oftentimes it's probably generational. I think if you're outside of a Native community, it's respectful to say either Native American, or if you can refer to someone directly by their tribal community, like for example, this person is a member of the Mashpee, or actually I should say a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. That's going to be the most respectful approach in terms of referring to Native American people.
There was a question in the chat that you answered by typing, but I just wanted to read that out since some people had to leave early or might be viewing this later. How has the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic impacted the WRWLRP's work? So if you want to expand on what you said, or I can just read what you said, or you can, either way.
Yeah, I mean, I can repeat what I wrote, and that is that it was extremely difficult. So like everybody else, in March 2020, we had to close our doors. The project at this point, so the film was actually filmed in 2010. So there's been a lot that's happened in the project for, the past decade or so, including the opening of our own language immersion school. When it started in 2016, it was just pre-K and K, and now we're up to 4th grade. So we're really modeling ourselves after a lot of Indigenous communities, but it was the Native Hawaiians in particular who created this model of language immersion within a school, what's called a nest, a language nest. So teaching language in an immersion format when it's remote and when it's online is really hard to do. We ended up employing a platform called Seesaw, which, I think the instructors did the best that they could within a remote format, but it definitely was not, it was a challenge, I'll say that, just because really language immersion should happen face-to-face, one-on-one. And even now with mask wearing, it's very difficult because obviously children model after what they see and what your mouth movements are. So it continues to be a challenge, but we're doing the best we can with what we have.
Thank you for bringing it up to sort of the present day and telling us a little bit about what's happened since the documentary came out. I just wanted to note for anyone who doesn't know that this came out in 2010. So it's a little bit old. So we're very grateful that you're here to answer our questions.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
All right. Has there been a recent push to have this video shown in every middle or high school in Massachusetts during civics classes?
There should be a push. So, this is definitely a challenge, not just in Massachusetts, but across the United States. Just to give you some context, so I have been working with the project since 2007, but I'm also the development director for the National Indian Education Association, which is a 52-year-old organization that is helping to improve academic outcomes for Native students. And one of the things that that I'm doing in my other work is to instill really in educators the fact that Native education is American education. And we have this whole concept of Native education for all. There are some states that are really good at it. For example, the state of Washington has a mandate for Native education for all. And I believe it was in 2018 that the social studies standards in Massachusetts were updated to include classes and curriculum that reflected the history, the culture, and the governance structures of tribal communities that are from Massachusetts, which is a good thing. But the challenge has been having curriculum for teachers to teach and then giving those teachers professional development so that they can understand the content within that curriculum and then imparting that curriculum within their classrooms. So those social studies mandates are now there. If any of you out there are educators, I encourage you to show the film, and either myself or other people from the project can certainly join your classes and do this type of a Q&A with your students, because I think it's vitally important.
Great, thank you. Pardon if this is intrusive, starts the question, but when Jessie Little Doe speaks of prophecies, is she talking about oral traditions or something else?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Is the question that a prophecy would be written down as opposed to transferred orally? I'm not sure I understand that.
Maybe the speaker can, or the question asker can clarify a little bit.
Oh, pardon me. All I wanted to ask was when she was saying that there is a prophecy that says such and such a thing, I wasn't sure where the prophecy came from and who said it and how we know what they said.
I don't know the answer to that either. That's probably a Jessie question. It's certainly become part of sort of the fabric, right? The understanding within the community that the language would come back. And that's something that Jessie has always communicated as part of the genesis really of her work and of this project's work. But I don't know where she got that from. Probably through dreams or visions of some sort. I don't know. Sorry.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if maybe that was the prophecy of the language coming back within 7 generations.
Exactly, right. That, and it's not just in this community. There are other communities as well that language is considered to be a living thing, right? That it's got life within it, that it's, maybe not a sentient being, but it's certainly a part of a community, right? So even if it goes away, it's laying in wait, it's dormant, and that with the right push, with the right person to push it along, it's just a matter of reviving it. And that's certainly the case with the Wampanoag community. I'm working with an organization in Montana as well, where there's just a handful of speakers, but it's the same sort of concept that the language is alive. It's just waiting for somebody to give it, more sustenance so that it can really become a much more integrated part of a community.
Thank you. There's a bunch of just really supportive comments about getting the film into schools, and a couple of calls for getting in touch with you, uh, partly to promote the film in schools. So if you could provide contact information for yourself or someone else on the project, that
Yep.
would be great. Thank you.
I'm putting my my email in the chat box.
Great. And next question, is Jessie still leading in the schools, or are there now a number of, quote, Jessies in terms of teachers in the immersion school?
So, so Jessie stepped away as sort of the head of the organization several years ago. She took on the role of vice chairperson of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, of which she is a citizen. Her role now is more around teaching other individuals the language, as opposed to sort of running the organization. But yes, there are lots of other Jessies that, well, lots is a relative term, of course. There are about 8 or 9 teachers who have high levels of fluency. And really that was the point 10 years ago, when not only this film came out, but the project also earned a grant from the Administration for Native Americans, which is a funding agency that's a sub-agency of the Department of Health and Human Services. And the Administration for Native Americans has a grant that's specifically for language preservation and maintenance. And it was through that grant that the Language Project conducted what was called a Master Apprentice program, where Jessie at the time was the master speaker. She was really the only speaker. And she had 3 apprentices that worked under her. And their job every day was to speak the language. So, 5 or 6 hours a day, she would just talk to them. And it's really through immersion that people learn language the best. Certainly it helps to understand the orthography of a language, the grammar, the nouns, the verbs, all that good stuff. But just like, when we're all learning language as children, it's not like anyone hands us a grammar book and says, this is a noun and this is a verb. It's just listening to it on a daily basis and letting your brain sort of figure out that orthography and the syntax. So that was Jessie's role 10 years ago when she did this Master Apprentice program. And it was out of that program that she gained 3 speakers, and those 3 speakers went on to teach others. So it really has become this exponential process over the past 11 years, where we can then go into schools. We've got classes in the local Mashpee Public High School. We are, as I mentioned, we have a language immersion school now going up from pre-K to 4th grade. So it's building that foundational community of speakers, and then having those speakers in turn teach others. So that's the idea behind that initial Master Apprentice program, and now what's really become a language movement within the tribal community.
That's really great that it's become exponential.
Mm-hmm.
How have the children in this video retained or expanded the knowledge of their language over the last 10 years?
Oh gosh, I can't speak to all of the children in that. I can tell you that when I became involved with the Language Project, my youngest daughter was 6 or 7 years old at the time. I had immersed her in the language from the time she was that age. And it was last year in 2020 that she was the first person ever in the state of Massachusetts history to be invited to pursue the seal of biliteracy in Massachusetts in an Indigenous language. So I could speak to my own daughter. Her name is Alyssa Harris. If you want to go Google her, she's all over the place. She's become an historical interpreter. She's one of our master speakers at this point. So I could talk about her all day. I don't know about the other kids. As for May, so May, the little one in the film, I think she's either a junior or senior in high school now, so she's all grown up, and she is still speaking the language. Jessie's other daughter, Tracy, is also involved with the language, and she just earned a master's degree in linguistics from MIT. So there's lots of folks who, started very early and who have continued to immerse themselves in this language work.
You all must be so proud. That's so great. There's another question. How many students are involved in the school? And there was a second question, but it sounds like you answered it already.
Yeah, so in the preschool, which is called Makayasak Wiku, which means the children's house. And to give you a little bit of context on that, our curriculum or our pedagogy is based on Montessori, right? So it's a child-focused, child-based approach to learning. And we actually joke around and we call it Wampasori, so Wampanoag and Montessori, Wampasori. But I think we've got 35 students at this point between pre-K and fourth grade. In addition, we do after-school programming in the Mashpee Public School District for elementary and middle school students. And that's not as intensive as the school. It's only about an hour a day, 3 days a week. But at the Mashpee High School itself, we are teaching grades 7 through 12 the language. And it's been a really great partnership. And what I think was most heartening to us was when they decided to allow Wampanoag to be taught as a language in their language department, they changed the name of the language department from foreign language to world language in recognition of the fact that Wôpanâak is not a foreign language. It's actually indigenous to this community. So that's been really lovely. And that started out as Wampanoag 1, then Wampanoag 2. We're up to Wampanoag 5 now. So there's 5 levels of Wampanoag language classes that are offered at Mashpee Public High School as credit-bearing language courses, similar to a French or a Spanish. Oh, and those, I think there are 24 enrolled students in the Mashpee Public High School.
Great. Yeah, that's a really important distinction, the distinction between foreign language and world language. So glad to hear that. Would you care to comment on the history of the area that is now widely called Belmont, Massachusetts?
I don't have any information about Belmont, sorry.
That's okay. We were talking before we got started as people were settling in about which tribes had resided in the area of Belmont historically.
Well, I can tell you this, that the Wampanoag were really a confederacy, right? That covered the sort of entire coastal area of Massachusetts, going west over to like Blackthorn or Blackstone Valley, of course, along the coast here, the Cape and the islands, and then even parts of Rhode Island. And before first contact with settlers, the population was believed to be about 150,000 individuals over 69 tribal communities, all of which were part of the Wampanoag Confederacy. After first contact, and actually even I think before the Pilgrims arrived, there was a fishing vessel that came to the coast here and brought disease, which we think a pandemic, interestingly enough, to have, how many years ago? 400 years ago. And we think it was yellow fever. We're not really sure. My daughter, who's this historical interpreter, says it's something called leptospirosis. But it really ravaged the Wampanoag community. And in a matter of 2 years, 2/3 of the population were gone from this disease. Then the Pilgrims showed up and they saw a lot of empty villages. And so there was the sense that it was manifest destiny that they should be there because there were grain stores and there were homes that were sort of ready to be moved into. But after that first contact, the population of the Wampanoag community was even more decimated by more disease, war, murder, all sorts of things. And this is part of what needs to be incorporated into our classroom curriculum, is that many people don't know about the King Philip's War. They don't know about the conflicts. They don't know about some of the tribal leaders that they should know about, like Samoset. And so Right now, today, there are, of the 69 original tribal communities, there are only 4 that are left. And the population has been reduced from the 150,000 or 4 down to about 4,500.
All right. And just a follow-up comment from the original question asker. The Massachusetts tribe website describes this area as the land they inhabited, which was gradually stolen.
And that's a true statement, right? So part of what the colonial government did to control the Native community was to put them into what was called praying towns. So Mashpee was a praying town. I think Natick was a praying town. I can't remember all of the praying towns, but it was a way to isolate Native communities into a very specific geographic area. And within that area, you had to make your confessions of conversion to Christianity. And by doing so, the colonial government would basically let you live your life, leave you alone for the most part. Otherwise, it was, you know, a free-for-all on Wampanoag people. And that's part of what, you know, created the conflict and the decimation of the community. But these are all stories, right, that need to be incorporated into our classrooms so that people understand, right, what happened 400 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years ago, and even now in all of our communities. So.
Yes. So a little while ago, you were talking about how many children are enrolled in the immersion school, and you said there were 24. And somebody was asking, I think maybe before you answered that question, how many children are fluent now, if you know that number?
Yeah, so actually in our immersion school, it's closer to 35. So we had a lot of loss of fluency over the past year, and we use what's called an ACTFL scale. It's an ACTFL is an acronym that stands for the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Languages, even though, again, we're not a foreign language. But there's a 12-point scale that assesses our speakers based on listening, speaking, and writing. And for little ones, it's a little bit hard to make that assessment. What often happens in the classroom is that we will speak to children in the language, and then they'll answer us back in English, because that's what they hear every day. They hear it in their homes, they hear it on TV, they're surrounded by it. It's a very gradual process. I would say that for our students, and the scale for ACTFL probably, it goes beginner, intermediate, advanced, and then within those stratas, there's further stratification. I would say that many of our students are an intermediate low in terms of their listening, like they can understand. And as they get more and more comfortable with speaking, they do so. But I would say that that's probably a good assessment of most of our little ones in particular. And they talked about it in the film. It's really with children that a language is going to come back home, because the language centers in our brains are most open when we're young. So that was really our point. Our strategic vision all along was to open a school starting with our little ones, our pre-K, our kindergarten, bring them in early, and then continue the school throughout their lives so that they could continue to hear the language on a day-to-day basis. Because again, you know, language is sort of embedded in your brain when you're nice and young, when you're a baby, when you're, you know, a couple of years old.
Thank you. So we've got just a few minutes left. Going to try to get to as many questions as we can. Did Nopscusset speak the same language? I might have butchered that.
I don't know who that is.
I don't know either. Maybe the original question asker can unmute or can clarify in the chat. But for the next question, about 5 years ago, the state of Massachusetts seemed close to give back some portions of the Wampanoag land to its people. Where do things stand now?
I did not know that. Okay. I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Let's see.
So from Helen, yeah, let's hear more about that.
Yeah. And then I think this is the last question. Could you speak a bit more about the connection of culture and language, especially for those who have become fluent? How has this changed their perceptions?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, that language and culture are inextricably linked. So if a community loses its language, it loses a lot of that cultural foundation from which the language came, right? So, and in the film, one of our tribal community members talks about it. It's like water. Like, how many ways can you describe water in the Wampanoag language, or the distinction between a man and a woman, and that you know, the man is a surface walker, where a woman is the one who is in charge of everything, and that speaks to, you know, how the culture is formed and what the values are and what the mores are. So you know, for, you know, me, for example, I lived in Japan for a couple of years, and, you know, in English, we say rice. In Japanese, there's all the stages of rice, right, which is an important staple in Japanese culture. And because of that, it's reflected in their language. It's the same sort of thing in the Wampanoag language. I don't know what other way to describe it, but I think that, you know, it's a tragedy that I think there's 7,000 Indigenous languages that are left in the world. Many of them are spoken by Indigenous people. And I think the Endangered Languages Project says that every 2 weeks, one of these languages goes silent because the last living speaker of the language has passed on. So with the dying of the languages goes that culture, right, that is inherent in the words that are spoken within that community every day. I don't know if that answers your question, but if not, I'll try to answer it a different way.
We do have a little bit more clarification from Anne. She writes, in 1614, English Captain Thomas Hunt captured over 20 Nauset. The Nubscusset Indians were part of the Nauset Confederation, and Patuxet Indians brought them to Spain and sold as many as he could into slavery. The captures outraged the Indians and they stopped the trading. In 1618 and 1619, a plague killed most of the Nubscusset. Possibly the burying of the dead from this plague marks the origin of this burial ground. I'm assuming they're copying from a website. The Nubscusset was the first tribe to meet the Mayflower Pilgrims. So just a little bit more background on that, I guess. But it sounds like maybe that's not a tribe that is living anymore.
Well, so I would say that all along this area in the Northeast, so Massachusetts, Maine, Connecticut, New York, all of the Indigenous languages that are spoken, that are still spoken, come from the Algonquian language family. So although it may not have been Wampanoag specifically, I'm sure it was a you know, one of the sister languages that were spoken. So, and I think we, you know, talk about it in the film that even though the language, the Wampanoag language was not spoken, we can look to, you know, the Passamaquoddy or Penobscot or Shinnecock tribal communities and the languages that they're still speaking and try to approximate words in our language because they are sister languages. So to put it into context, it's like Latin-based languages. If you know Latin, right, you can understand the words that are in French or Spanish or Portuguese because it's all part of that same language family. It's the same thing with Algonquian languages. So I would assume that if not speaking Wampanoag, at least it's a sister language where they probably were able to understand each other. I hope that answers your question. Oh, I see a question about the Department of Interior's attempt to steal. Yes.
Yeah, it looked like just a comment, but we can read that out.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, that was,
The stealing is ongoing. Oh, the
it
U.S.
is.
Department of Interior's 2020 attempt to revoke the tribe's reservation status in the midst of the pandemic.
Right. Thankfully, there was a ruling against that. And the person who is the head of the Department of Interior was doing then President Trump's bidding. And it really, in my opinion, is all around gaming and the sense that the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, who are pursuing gaming as an economic development opportunity, would create a competitive disadvantage to Trump's buddies who now have their own casinos up in Boston and Springfield. You know, the Steve Wynns and folks like that. So that was part, I think, of the attempt to revoke the tribe's reservation status, because without a reservation, you cannot do gaming. So anyway, that has been halted for now.
I'm glad to hear that. All right, I'm going to share the survey link one more time. If people want to click on that link just to grab it before we close out the Zoom session, because when I close it, it'll disappear. Thank you so much, Judi, and for everybody who came. Again, this was Belmont, the very first Indigenous Peoples Day, so named, is happening Monday. So we're so pleased to be able to offer this program in recognition of that change, that important change. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.